Dr. Goodenough for History 201, and this is the recording that I mentioned on Wednesday I would make in relation to the study guide. Obviously, we had that review session very briefly at the end, just because our presentations kind of went up. We kind of cut it close, which is totally fine. And by the way, those were all great presentations and projects. And then, as I mentioned, just because I had promised that you would have a review session, I thought, even if we didn't get a full one in class, we should still have a little bit more review as we prepare for this exam on Monday at 8. So I want to stress that it's the same time as our normal class, but it's at 8 a.m. So we need to be there by 8. So get there a little bit early because the exam will begin promptly at 8. And it's not, I wouldn't stress about it if you haven't been studying or something like that. I wouldn't try to wing it in that respect. However, it's not stressful because it's not cumulative. You only have to focus on the material that we studied from the midterm and on. So it's not cumulative or anything like that. And the exam isn't designed to take 2 hours to complete. It is designed that within 75 minutes you could get a really strong response, but I know some of you like to, kind of rush your exams and take a half an hour, 40 minutes or something like that. Do not do that for the final, just because this is then the last grade. So you have your other grades and you kind of know where you stand. If you're really trying to get to that next letter grade, if you're at a 78, 79%, doing well on a 100-point exam can make a big difference. Now, if you're kind of comfortable with your grades, be strategic for your other classes. I recognize this isn't your only class, but that's your decision, right? That's for you to decide and how you want to prep for this. But definitely, don't wait until, Sunday night to even open up and start, really kind of cracking the books, as they say, or whatever that phrase is, to start prepping for it. But very simple, just to review, 25 multiple choice questions at 2 points each, and then, of course, those short answer questions, 5 of them at 10 points each. Now, in these short answer questions, I'm going to expect more from the midterm just because you've been in the class longer and you know how to think more critically, you know how to examine and weigh ideas and shape responses and things like that. So I do want to see more problem solving and creative thought in your responses. But again, they're short answer questions, so give me a couple paragraphs. If you think of it, when we did those event reflections in class, you were doing roughly, if you were meeting those requirements, 3 to 5 paragraphs in about 20 minutes. And so, you can do more than a couple sentences in an exam when you have 75 minutes to the max of 2 hours to complete it. So I want you to write as much as you can on these short answer questions because they are designed a little bit more, not intensely, but they do require more elaboration than the midterm just because you've been doing it more throughout the semester. So let's get into it. We left off our review session on Wednesday. We were talking about the Aztec, the conquest of the Aztec, how Cortez leveraged the political scene in order to overthrow the Aztec Empire. He didn't charge into Tenochtitlan with 200,000 soldiers or something like that. Instead, he used his kind of I think that the term that was used in class, he finessed, or he kind of manipulated the scene to his benefit. And we talked about how the Florentine Codex contained a lot of this information about blood sacrifice and Cortez's incursions into the Aztec Empire. So let's start off with the Atlantic revolutions, where perhaps you'll have some questions about this, right? This is all fair game on the exam. And so the lesson on Atlantic revolutions really jump-started this much larger conversation that we had throughout the second half of the semester in relation to how people who were frustrated with the social scene or the political scenes, those kinds of things, how the people resisted, challenged, or even overthrew systems that they felt were unfair, unjust, etc. And the Atlantic revolutions is this term historians use to outline or kind of review this conflagration of revolution that occurred throughout the Atlantic world. I mean, it was like from the end of the 1700s through the first half of the 1800s, you just have this series of revolutions taking place in the Atlantic world. And no better place to start with the Atlantic revolutions, of course, than the American Revolution, which is related to North America. This is where the country that we're in today originated from. It's the kind of progenitor, the starter of these Atlantic revolutions. So the American Revolution started when the 13 colonies decided that the the situation between the British Empire and its colonies was unfair due to the power that the British monarchy and the British state had over colonial economic arrangements, in particular things related to taxation, uh, representation and things like that. And so the American Revolution really offered this vision of how the people could reimagine the relationship they had with their governments. Is that the American revolutionaries argued that taxation is fine, but if you want to tax us, we need to have actual representation, and we need to be able to elect people who make decisions on taxation rather than it being this very forceful top down kind of situation that we're seeing as colonial subjects of the crown. And so for years, the colonists had been advocating for, and this is something we often forget because it kind of disrupts the narrative of our country, the myth, if you will, that, hey, we want representation in parliament. It wasn't like initially they said we're going to start our own country. They just wanted actual representation in parliament. But then, after the refusal of the British to do so, that's when there started to become this idea that perhaps we should separate ourselves or divorce the empire and start our own nation state in the result of that resistance. So the American Revolution, just to highlight this once again, offered this idea of the relationship that the people could have with their governments, and they fought a violent revolution in order to secure that vision. Whether that vision was real or imagined, we know that the rallying cry was liberty, freedom, things like that all men are created equal. Of course, though, we understand that freedom didn't extend to everyone. It didn't extend to those who did not own land. If they were white, you had to own land. So if you were a white American and you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. If you were a woman, you were excluded from this vision of freedom. If you were a slave, you were excluded from this vision of freedom. Indigenous nations were also excluded from this. But nevertheless, as an intellectual revolution, just as much as a physical and violent revolution, the American Revolution showcased what could happen when people decide to resist these power structures. Because at the time, the British were the military superpower, right? And so by them resisting this and defeating the British, it really showcased what people could do when they banded together in collective action to resist, systems of oppression. And so through the American Revolution and through its successes, it actually worked to inspire other revolutions throughout the world. But for our purposes, we're just thinking about the Atlantic revolutions. And so as something that was an inspiration, the people in France started to wonder what they could do to kind of challenge the systems that they felt were oppressive to them. And so Louis XVI, right, the last monarch of France, had immense wealth. He's in Versailles, living this life of luxury. The French peasants are starving. They don't have any political power, anything like that. And they see that in the United States, hey, you can overthrow, right, your leaders if you band together. And so starting in the late 1700s, in 1789, the French people decided to have this revolution to overthrow the monarchy. And the story about this is quite interesting because unlike Britain, which had a parliament and things like that, France had the estates, the estates, and there were three of them. There was the estate, of kind of the royalty, the noble people, the estate of the clergy of the church, which was a major landholder as well. And then the third estate was everyone else, just the people. And each estate had one vote in order to make decisions on France. And traditionally throughout history of this system is that the nobles and the church voted together and two outweighs one. And so the nobles and the church could dominate the people in political decision making. And the French people decided, to hell with that, right? This isn't fair. Like we want to be able to have our needs met, and therefore we will remove ourselves from this system and start our own. And that's what the French Revolution was that this estate of everyone else, the people, rising up and violently overthrowing the monarchy. And so we use the French Revolution as a kind of counter to the American Revolution. Both were violent. Both had acts of revolutionary violence, but the French, through their frustrations, right, of literally being starved, used the violence, the revolutionary fervor to kind of go as far as they could. And so we talked about how perhaps the French Revolution was this kind of explosion of violence, of frustration that ultimately would spell its downfall, whereas the American Revolution, though violent in the beginning, became much more restrained after the revolutionaries had secured their quote unquote freedom. So the reason we use this as a counter is just to explain the pace and kind of complexity of history. And so we pointed to the Jacobins as an example of this revolutionary violence in France. They were led by Maximilien Robespierre. He became the leader of this very creepy group called the Committee on Public Safety, and said, we're taking over this revolution, and anyone who's not with us is against us. There's no in between, is what Robespierre is saying during the Reign of Terror. And he's even saying to the French people, if you suspect your neighbor isn't 100% in, if you suspect your parents aren't 100% in, or your children, or your wife or your husband, if you suspect any of them have any questions about our revolution, give their names to us and we'll chop off their head. And that's what the Reign of Terror was. And it began in many ways with the execution of the king as a kind of metaphorical thing. And then after the execution of the king, that's when we get the actual Reign of Terror, where everyone else starts getting their heads chopped off, right? And the Jacobins are kind of going nuts with that during the Reign of Terror, where they're executing everybody. And so tens of thousands of people who perhaps had fought for freedom, right, in the French Revolution, after a while they start looking at this situation and they're like, hey, wait a minute, right? We just wanted to get rid of the monarch. Like, we didn't want what the Jacobins are doing. We don't want this terror. We don't want to live in fear. We want, just basic freedoms and things like that. And so what ends up happening to the French Revolution is that they end up getting Napoleon, who becomes an emperor. He's a military man. He's fighting in the French Revolutionary Wars, and he rises to power and names himself emperor of France and the French Empire. And that's a great irony, because if you think of it, they started off with a king and ended up with an emperor. Whereas in the United States, they started off with a king, King George III, and ended up with a democratic republic, right? So in the French Revolution, it ultimately failed because the promises of the revolutionaries in many ways got hijacked by this violence, and the French people became frustrated with the bloodshed and accepted Napoleon, right? I mean, it's the great irony of history to end up with even a more dictatorial kind of leader through Napoleon. So we use those two revolutions to think about how people, when imagining the kinds of roles they can play in their own destiny, is that it's not always successful, right? And that sometimes it can kind of take a dark turn, as we saw with the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. Another revolution that we explored to kind of explore this idea even more was the Haitian Revolution. And we talked about Toussaint L'Ouverture, who led this revolution, the only successful slave revolution in world history. And it's remarkable, right? Is that the Haitian Revolution is this moment where slaves are fighting for their freedom, they're killing their masters, and creating their own nation state, is that they're being influenced by both the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and saying, hey, we don't even want the right to vote like the Americans do, or we don't even want to get rid of this estate system like France. Like, we want freedom, like literally. We don't want to be slaves anymore. And they fought for their freedom and established the new nation state of Haiti, and that was led by Toussaint L'Ouverture, this military leader, quite skillful in military tactics and things like that, and secured the freedom of Haiti. So those were the three major revolutions that we thought about. There were more in this Atlantic revolutionary period, the Bolivarian revolutions in South America, etc., and that all over the world is what I'm trying to say, is that we see people in the 17 and 1800s really challenging structures of power that had existed for hundreds, thousands of years in many ways. to finally say enough is enough. And so there's a slide in the PowerPoint on Moodle that kind of explores the broader picture, the revolutionary outcomes, which is the United States became a stable republic. It's the same republic that's existed from the start. France has not been successful. If you look at it, they've had a number of republics, and so their country has undergone these challenges over time just due to the violence of the Reign of Terror, is it didn't create a stable country. We talked about how Haiti, being a successful slave revolution, eventually succumbed to the power of outside forces, and Haiti today is still dealing with that. The United States has invaded and occupied Haiti multiple times throughout its history, right? Many people don't realize that. In fact, during the early 20th century, the U.S. Marines literally were the police force in Haiti as the United States kind of occupied it. And again, today, right, we see the instability caused by those outside forces. So these revolutionary outcomes are messy, is what we tried to paint, but also we also kind of looked at what this all means in the history of humanity. And so then after that, what we started to explore were other ideas about challenges to power, to freedom, etc. And we talked about the scramble for Africa, and we looked at how during the late 1800s, many European powers set their eyes on Africa, and they literally carved out, kingdoms and colonies for themselves in Africa. And we looked at several different cases of this, 2 case studies. And what I would suggest you focus on for the exam, and I'm not going to give you the question outright, but it would be useful to know who King Leopold II was, the Belgian monarch who created the Congo, his Congo Free State, essentially his own personal colony, where he said, I own, millions of acres of land, and you are going to, he's telling this to his bureaucrats, you are going to extract as much wealth as you can from this colony and give me the money. And so this became what's known as the Rubber Terror, where Leopold II is demanding, this wealth. And rubber became important during this time period, obviously, for industrialization and things like that. And we talked about the violence during the Rubber Terror, where it's absolute tragedies, right? Where hundreds of thousands, millions of people are affected by this, and the chaos and violence that ensued from King Leopold's kind of greed and things like that. So we talked about the Rubber Terror. We talked about how the motives for empire in the scramble, which was a form of new imperialism, related to several ideas, but most notably white supremacy, this idea that Europeans are better than everyone else and therefore have the right to dominate weaker societies. And King Leopold II really kind of imagined himself along those lines, and we talked about the tragedy of that. We even watched a video, and you researched the Rubber Terror for your event reflection. And so we talked a lot of those things, and how this showcased that even with, if we go all the way back to the Atlantic revolutions, by the late 1800s, right, the world's not perfect, and it probably never will be. So next, after the Scramble for Africa week that we had, we explored then one final kind of violent revolution in class, which was the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution is this very broad term. There were several revolutions in Russia. However, for us, what we need to think about is just what's commonly referred to as Red October, or the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, decided, hey, let's overthrow the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty and create a new kind of society. So, being influenced by the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the Bolsheviks were, but what they decided differently is that it's not enough to have political representation, is that we need to take control over all aspects of society, most notably the economy. So this was a Marxist revolution in many respects, where the Bolsheviks take over the Russian state and then nationalize and eliminate private property and things like that. What we focused on in our discussion and kind of learning about the Russian Revolution, if we did that PowerPoint slide as a group, if you remember, but what we talked about Most notably was Rasputin. We talked about how Rasputin was this Russian mystic who had this influence on the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty, and how the Bolsheviks would use this as further examples of why we need to overthrow the Romanov dynasty. And then we focused on the actual, what the Bolsheviks called liquidation. They use that term to the murder, essentially, but they murdered the Romanov dynasty, the children, everyone, in order to kind of accomplish their revolutionary goals. And so they created the world's first true communist state, if you want to call it true communism. It is what it is, right? It was, command economy, but still had market elements in the global scene. But nevertheless, the Russian Revolution is what created the USSR eventually. And so one more revolution that we explored. And then after that, we didn't have a meeting in class. You were assigned to watch a video on the Nazi invasion of Poland. So hopefully you watched that first, part of that documentary, just to learn about how during the 20th century, you don't only have the USSR, but you also have the rise of fascism in Europe as well, most notably with the Nazi regime, the Third Reich, and how they had their own idea on how the world should look, and that they rose up and kind of took over the reins of German society, and then took that power and spread elsewhere, and actually began World War II in a lot of ways. And so you watch that documentary on the Nazi invasion of Poland, be familiar with that. At least, what we watched is a broad kind of idea. So we didn't meet during that class. You just had that brief assignment. And then when we came back into class to meet and kind of talk, I was still sick at the next lesson, which was Gandhi. And so we talked about and used the PowerPoint for that. I was really sick, and so I was coughing the whole time, and I apologize for that. I didn't want to cancel class. I just wanted to highlight some of the major ideas. Maybe I'll scale back some of the questions related to Gandhi. Just be familiar with the kind of overall idea that the British Raj relates to the rule of India, that Gandhi led the decolonization efforts, and that if we want to call this a revolution, it was a nonviolent revolution, is that Gandhi led this nonviolent kind of revolution to overthrow the British rule of the Indian subcontinent. And so he was kind of the reason I picked him, after we talked about all these bloody things, is to show that it's not always needed, right? As Gandhi showed that you can overthrow systems of power without having a violent revolution, and he was successful in that. India today is the world's largest democracy. It's a democracy, and they have over 1 billion people, and that's amazing. That's remarkable, right? And Gandhi was the kind of leader of that. But again, of course, due to his acts of nonviolence, he was assassinated by people who wanted a more, they wanted retribution. They wanted what the French did, right, in the French Revolution, or what the Bolsheviks did to the Romanovs. And so Gandhi was assassinated for not being radical enough. But he was a kind of, he was a peacemaker in a lot of ways. So then after that, we came back and we talked about the student uprisings, and this was our kind of last in-person meeting where we really focused on some major ideas. Is that during the late 1960s, it starts in the United States with American college students who are frustrated with the systems that they see as oppressive, sexism, racism, things like that, the Vietnam War, etc., and they started to have an uprising as well. So be familiar with how that starts in some ways, what that represents, the student movement, and then the broad term for this kind of late 60s is Global 68. And so if it begins in the United States with students, resisting forms of power and rising up, we even use the example of Columbia University, Columbia 68, where students took over the university, right? They went into the president's office, they had a hostage, and they were, taking over the university. Is that the American students really inspired, in many ways, uprisings across the world amongst young people. So Mexico in 1968 has a student movement. In France, there's that wildcat strike that we talked about, is that all over the world, young people started to resist systems of power. These were the boomers, right, who are still alive today. They're aging now. But either way, during the 1960s and early 1970s, they were very vocal about uh, the problems they saw with the world, and work diligently to try to achieve a more just and equal society. Now, again, right, they may not have been successful in the long term when you think about that those things still exist today, inequality and justice. But nevertheless, again, we have to see both sides of the coin, is that they started a conversation about, building a better world. And so after that, we didn't really have much of class. One of our lessons was going to be on 9/11 and then COVID-19. Just be familiar. I didn't really have you do any work on it, but we know those stories as much. We know about them, but just more focus on the things that I mentioned. Um, you know, the major terms, the Renaissance. The Leonardo da Vinci, the Medici family, the Aztecs, blood sacrifice, the Atlantic revolutions, and then Global 68. And I'm sure you'll do fine on the exam if you take your time to study, if you take your time to think through it. It won't be difficult. So if you have any questions, I'm going to get this uploaded as soon as possible. Usually takes a while to compress, and then I'll just put it on YouTube and then email you all out the link. So just feel free to ask me any questions. Just don't wait till Sunday night asking questions, because it's I'll be asleep, and then I don't want you to be waiting until the last minute. Is send a question Saturday or Sunday morning or something, and then you'll be good to go. I'll have extra pieces of paper, so you don't have to bring paper if you don't want to, but you are able to bring notebook paper that's blank, of course, if you want to write on that instead of computer paper, and we'll be good to go. So awesome job this semester. I know you all worked hard, and I try to find a balance in this class. When I started here teaching, I always read the class reviews, and my classes were a little too difficult, I was told by some of the students. So I tried to find this balance. I want you to be challenged. I want you to think. That's the point of taking a history class. It's not to have you memorize dates and things like that. It's designed to get you to think critically and examine the world in a way that's historical, right? And I hope I accomplished that, and I hope you had fun at least with some of these lessons, learning about our past. Because as I mentioned, right at the beginning of the semester, all the way back in August, we started with the beginning of everything, and then we came up as close as we could to the present. And that's a long time. So hopefully you can kind of look back on this class and think about some of those things that we discussed and learned about. So it was a great semester. It was fun with you all in class. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to stop the recording here.